A crystal glass shatters against marble. The music stops mid-note. Every head at the engagement dinner turns toward the CEO, his hands still trembling, his face drained white, his eyes locked across the ballroom on a 5-year-old boy he has never met. The boy has his exact jaw, his exact eyes, and he's standing quietly beside the woman this man's own mother threw out into the rain 5 years ago, with nothing but a suitcase and a lie. The board is watching. The press is watching. His fiancée is 3 feet away. And in the next 60 seconds, the empire his family built on that lie is going to collapse in front of all of them. She didn't recognize the ring until it caught the chandelier light, the same one she'd worn 5 years ago, the night his mother threw it at her feet and told her to disappear. Now it sat on another woman's finger, 3 tables away, at his engagement dinner. The ballroom was filled with the low, pleasant hum of soft jazz and the delicate clinking of crystal glasses. Warm gold light filtered down from the vaulted ceiling, reflecting off polished marble floors and grand floral arrangements of white orchids. It was an environment built for high society, an effortless display of wealth, power, and image. She stood near the edge of the dining hall, wearing a simple, elegant navy dress, her dark hair pulled back into a neat, low bun. Her posture was straight, her composure immaculate. Over the last 5 years, she had worked tirelessly to rebuild her life abroad, clawing her way up from an exhausted, heartbroken outcast to a respected professional. She was only attending tonight's gala because her firm had been hired to oversee the international media relations for the high-profile corporate merger being celebrated. She had known the merger involved his family's enterprise. She had even known he was getting married. But nothing could have prepared her for the sight of that silver band, with its distinct, vintage double halo setting, adorning another woman's hand. It was a family heirloom, passed down through generations of his lineage. A ring meant to symbolize eternal trust. Her chest tightened, a brief, silent wave of memory threatening to unmoor her. But she drew a slow, quiet breath, grounding herself. She was no longer that frightened, helpless young woman who had been swept out into the cold. She had her dignity now. She had her independence. And, most importantly, she had him. A soft, small hand tugged gently at her sleeve. "Mommy," a quiet, clear voice whispered. She looked down into the big, bright eyes of her 5-year-old son. He was dressed in a tiny charcoal suit with a little black bow tie, looking far too handsome for his young age. He had been so good all evening, sitting quietly at the staff table while she coordinated with the press team. "Yes, my love," she murmured, kneeling down slightly so they were at eye level. Her voice was automatically soft, a haven of warmth amidst the cold grandeur of the room. The little boy pointed a small finger past the floral centerpieces, directing her gaze straight toward the head table elevated at the front of the hall. "Mommy, that's the man from the picture," he said innocently. Her heart dropped into her stomach. "What picture, sweetie?" she asked softly, though deep down, a terrible realization was already beginning to dawn. "The one in your velvet box under the bed," the boy replied, his tone full of simple, unfiltered curiosity. "The man standing next to you by the water." She froze. She had kept a single photograph hidden away, not out of longing, but as a silent record of a life that once was, a piece of history she knew her son might one day ask about. She hadn't realized he had ever seen it. Slowly, almost against her own will, she turned her head, and there he was. He was standing near the center table, holding a glass of champagne, surrounded by investors and family members. He looked older, his jawline sharper, his shoulders carrying the heavy weight of a man who had inherited an empire. He wore a tailored dark suit that fitted him perfectly, yet beneath the polished surface, he still carried that same distant, unreadable expression, The exact same look he had worn the night he let his family destroy her without saying a single word in her defense. Beside him sat his mother, the family matriarch, glowing with triumphant pride as she held court with the surrounding guests. And next to him was his fiancée, a striking, intelligent-looking woman smiling politely at the crowd. Then, as if drawn by an invisible thread, his eyes shifted away from his mother's conversation. He looked past his fiancée, past his mother, past the sea of wealthy guests and towering flower arrangements. His eyes locked straight onto the boy standing beside her. The room seemed to lose all sound. For a long, suffocating moment, time suspended itself. He stared at the little boy, the small, unmistakable mirror image of his own childhood self, right down to the gentle curve of his brow and the dark, deep-set eyes. The CEO's face drained of color. The cold, controlled mask he had maintained for 5 years shattered in a single fraction of a second. His hand began to tremble violently. The crystal glass slipped from his fingers, shattering loudly as it hit the polished marble floor. The sharp crack of crystal against marble echoed through the grand ballroom, cutting through the swell of soft jazz and polite conversation. A sudden silence rippled outward from the head table. Conversation sputtered out, heads turned, and nearby waiters rushed forward with cloth napkins, eager to clean the spill. "Arthur." The matriarch's voice was sharp, a low warning wrapped in forced concern as she touched her son's arm. She followed his frozen, wide-eyed gaze across the room, her brow furrowing in annoyance, until her eyes landed on the small boy in the tiny charcoal suit. The breath caught in her throat. Her hand tightened on Arthur's sleeve so hard her knuckles turned white. For a fraction of a second, the immaculate composure she had cultivated for decades wavered. She recognized those eyes. She recognized the shape of that jaw. It was like looking at a ghost. Beside Arthur, his fiancée, Victoria, set her own glass down with quiet deliberation. She was an observant woman, trained in corporate negotiation to read the smallest shifts in a room. She looked at Arthur's pale, trembling hands, then at his mother's rigid posture, and finally followed their shared gaze down the length of the hall. Victoria's eyes narrowed slightly. Something was deeply wrong. Across the room, the woman felt the full, suffocating weight of the room's attention shifting toward them. Her instincts, honed by 5 years of self-reliance, screamed at her to act. She couldn't let her son be dragged into their gilded snake pit. She wouldn't let his innocence be ruined by the same people who had crushed hers. "Come, sweetheart," she whispered smoothly, keeping her voice completely calm despite the pounding in her chest. She took her son's small hand in hers. She didn't run. Running implied guilt, and she had done nothing wrong. Instead, with cool, effortless poise, she turned on her heel and began walking toward the double mahogany doors leading to the grand foyer, intending to slip out quietly into the night air. "Wait." Arthur's voice broke the heavy silence, rough and strained, cracking with a wild emotion no one in his inner circle had ever heard from him before. He took a step forward, blindly pushing past a waiter who was still kneeling by the broken glass. "Arthur, sit down," his mother commanded in a harsh, furious whisper, rising partially from her chair. "You are making a scene in front of the press and the board." "Mother, stay out of this," Arthur snapped, his voice cold enough to freeze the room. He didn't care about the board. He didn't care about the merger. For 5 long years, he had lived in a hollow shell of regret, convincing himself that moving on was his only option. But seeing that child, his child, carrying his face and standing beside the woman he had failed, shattered every wall he had built around his heart. He stepped away from the head table and started striding quickly across the marble floor toward the exit. Victoria watched him go, her expression unreadable, though a quiet seed of suspicion had officially taken root. Before the woman could reach the heavy exit doors, Two security guards stationed at the foyer entrance stepped slightly into her path, hesitant, glancing back at Arthur as he closed the distance. She stopped, holding her son tightly behind her dress. Her chin lifted high as Arthur halted just a few feet away, breathing heavily, his eyes desperate as he searched her calm, guarded face. The heavy silence between them in the foyer seemed to dissolve, stretching back through time, pulling her back 5 years to the night her world had ended. It had been a cold, rain-slicked Tuesday night when the matriarch summoned her to the family's private study. She had been just 3 months pregnant, carrying the small, quiet secret that was supposed to bring them all together. Instead, she was met with a room full of cold, unforgiving eyes and a thick white envelope sitting on the mahogany desk. "You think you're clever, don't you?" His mother had sneered, her voice dripping with venom as she tossed a set of falsified paternity documents across the desk. "You thought you could trap my son, steal into our family, and secure a fortune for a child that isn't even his." She had stood there, stunned, her hand instinctively resting over her abdomen. "That's not true," she had whispered, her voice trembling. "Arthur, tell her. You know the truth." She had turned to Arthur, searching his face for support, begging him with her eyes to stand up for her, to defend their love, to protect their unborn child. But Arthur had remained standing near the fireplace, his eyes fixed firmly on the floor. He was paralyzed by fear, afraid of his mother's wrath, afraid of losing his inheritance, and too weak to challenge the narrative his family had constructed. His silence was a betrayal far deeper than any word his mother could have spoken. "He knows enough not to be fooled by an opportunistic girl," his mother had declared coldly. She had snatched the vintage ring from the table, the family heirloom she had reluctantly gifted months earlier, and threw it directly at her feet. "Take your things and get out. If you ever try to contact my son again or spread these lies to the press, I will make sure you never work or live peacefully in this country again." No one had helped her pack. No one had offered her a ride. She had walked out into the pouring rain with a single suitcase, her heart shattered, and a choice to make. She could stay and break herself against their endless wall of power and lies, or she could leave and build a life worthy of the child growing inside her. She had chosen dignity. She had boarded a flight abroad, wiped away her tears, and sworn that neither she nor her child would ever bow to that family again. Now, standing in the bright chandelier light of the foyer 5 years later, the woman met Arthur's desperate gaze with eyes that were entirely clear, cool, and free of fear. "Let us pass, Arthur," she said, her voice calm, measured, and completely devoid of bitterness. "We have nowhere to be with you." "Please," Arthur rasped, taking a single step closer, though he stopped himself before reaching out. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, knuckles pale. "Just talk to me for 5 minutes. Please." "There is nothing left to discuss, Arthur," she replied, her voice remaining remarkably even, a steady anchor in the sudden tempest of his distress. She kept her hand gently on her son's shoulder, keeping the boy positioned safely behind her. "Our business ended 5 years ago. Is he?" Arthur's breath caught in his throat, his eyes darting down to the boy before locking back onto her face with an agonizing mix of hope and terror. "Is he mine?" A faint, ironic smile touched her lips, though there was no malice in it, only the profound distance of a woman who had long since healed from the wound he caused. "You answered that question yourself 5 years ago," she said quietly. "When your mother threw that paper on the desk and called me a liar, you stood by the fire and said nothing. You made your choice then, Arthur. You decided he wasn't yours so you wouldn't have to fight for him." Every word was like a quiet knife to his chest, precise and undeniably true. "I was weak," he confessed, the admission torn from him, low and raw. "I was afraid. I let my mother control everything. I've lived with that regret every single day since you left." Regret doesn't change the past, she said softly, and it certainly doesn't earn you a place in his future. Before Arthur could reply, the polished heavy doors of the main hall swung open further. Heavy, deliberate footsteps echoed across the marble floor as his mother strode into the foyer, flanked by 2 senior board members and Victoria. The matriarch's face was a mask of rigid authority, though her eyes burned with suppressed panic. "Arthur, that is enough," his mother commanded, her voice ringing sharply through the high-ceilinged space. "You are embarrassing this family and our guests. Step away from this woman." "Mother, stay back," Arthur warned without turning around, his focus never leaving his former wife. "I will do no such thing," the older woman declared, stepping right up beside her son. She cast a cold, dismissive glare at the young mother. "I see you've returned to cause trouble just as we are finalizing the merger. How convenient that you show up now, carrying a child you claim belongs to this family, looking for a payout." The young mother didn't flinch. She simply looked at the matriarch with a quiet, unwavering strength that made the older woman's jaw tighten. "I am not here for your money, nor your family," she said calmly, raising her head high. "My firm was hired to manage the press for this event. I am here doing my job, and now my son and I are leaving." She shifted to walk past them, but before she could take 2 steps, a tiny voice broke the tense silence. "Are you the angry lady from the story?" The little boy had peeked out from behind his mother's dress, his wide, dark eyes fixed entirely on the matriarch. The foyer fell into a dead, suffocating silence. The matriarch froze, her aristocratic features hardening into a mask of pure indignation. "What did you just say?" she whispered, her voice laced with sharp disbelief. The young mother felt a surge of protectiveness, but before she could gently pull her son back, the 5-year-old stepped out completely from behind her dress. He looked up at the tall adults with the unbothered, absolute clarity only a child possesses. "Mommy told me a bedtime story once," the little boy explained softly, his voice echoing in the grand, high-ceilinged room, "about a grand castle with a mean queen who didn't know how to love people. So she threw away the sweetest thing in the world because she was scared of the truth." His dark, intelligent eyes shifted from the matriarch to Arthur. "And there was a prince who was too quiet to say stop." Arthur gasped, the breath catching in his throat as if he'd been physically struck. Tears welled at the corners of his eyes, shining under the chandelier light. The raw, innocent perception of his own son laid his deepest shame bare in front of everyone present. He fell to one knee right there on the cold marble, bringing himself down to the boy's eye level. I was too quiet," Arthur choked out, his voice cracking with emotion. "You're right, little man. I was so quiet when I should have been loud." He reached out a trembling hand, stopping inches away, desperately wishing to touch his son's shoulder but refraining out of respect. "What is your name?" "Leo," the boy answered plainly. He looked down at Arthur's trembling hand, then back up at his face. "Why are you crying, mister? Are you the quiet prince?" "Arthur, get up off the floor this instant," his mother hissed, stepping forward and reaching out to grab her son's arm. Her face was flushed with embarrassment, her eyes darting nervously toward the main doors where guests and board members were beginning to linger. "You are losing your mind. This child has been coached. She trained him to say these things to humiliate us." "He wasn't coached, mother," Arthur roared, dropping his head and standing up so abruptly that his mother recoiled. The sudden burst of anger in his usually passive voice startled everyone. He turned on her, his face pale with rage. "Look at him. Look at his face, his eyes, his hands. He is my son. He was always my son, and you made me throw him away. He is a threat to this family's legacy." She snapped back, dropping her polite facade for a brief, ugly second. Standing a few paces behind them, Victoria watched the exchange, her sharp eyes taking in every detail. The matriarch's uncharacteristic panic, Arthur's profound grief, and the quiet, immovable dignity of the woman holding the little boy's hand. The pieces of a puzzle she hadn't even known she was solving began to fit together. The young mother placed a gentle hand on Leo's shoulder, drawing him back to her side. She looked at Arthur, not with anger, but with a sorrowful pity. "We are leaving now, Arthur," she said softly, her tone carrying the finality of an iron door closing. "Don't follow us. Wait." The matriarch's voice whipped through the hall, sharp and desperate as she scrambled to regain control. She stepped around Arthur, moving with a sudden predator-like speed to position herself between the young mother and the glass exit doors. Her tailored posture was rigid, but the twitch in her tight jaw betrayed her growing panic. The merger with Victoria's family enterprise was worth hundreds of millions. It was the crowning achievement of her lifetime, designed to secure her family's prestige for generations. If a scandalous paternity cover-up leaked to the board or the press gathered inside, the entire deal would collapse before midnight. "You aren't walking out of here like this," the older woman said, lowering her voice into a cold, venomous whisper intended only for the three of them. Her eyes glittered with dark warning. "I know what you're doing. You brought this boy here to cause a scene, to jeopardize Arthur's engagement, and to blackmail my family for a settlement." The young mother didn't step back. She held her ground, looking down at the matriarch with a calm, penetrating gaze. "I didn't ask to be assigned to this event, and I certainly didn't ask to see your face again," she replied softly, her voice cool and steady. "I have built my own life without a single cent of your money. I don't want your wealth, and I don't want your family. Then sign a non-disclosure agreement tonight," the matriarch demanded, leaning in slightly, her voice shaking with restrained fury. "Name your price. A house abroad, a trust fund for the boy, whatever it takes for you to take your child. Leave this country tomorrow morning, and never speak Arthur's name again. If you refuse, I will use every lawyer on our payroll to make sure your media firm loses every corporate contract it holds in this city by sunrise." A heavy silence fell. Arthur stared at his mother in absolute horror. "Mother, stop," he breathed, his voice hollow. "Are you actually threatening her? After everything you already stole from us?" "I am protecting this family," the matriarch snapped, glaring at her son. "I am protecting your future. Do you think Victoria's family will marry into a public circus? Do you think the board will keep you as CEO if the scandal breaks?" "I don't care about the board," Arthur shouted, his composure shattering entirely. Before the matriarch could fire back, a quiet, controlled voice broke into the argument from behind them. "I care about the truth, though." They all turned. Victoria stepped forward from the shadow of the arched entryway, her hands folded calmly in front of her. Her face was devoid of anger, but her intelligent eyes were sharp, analytical, and dangerously focused on the matriarch. "Victoria," the matriarch stammered, her face draining of color as her polished facade cracked even further. "My dear, please ignore this. It's just a bitter former acquaintance trying to disrupt our special night." "I am not blind, Eleanor," Victoria interrupted smoothly, her voice icy and precise. "And I am certainly not stupid. That boy looks exactly like Arthur did in his childhood portraits hanging in your estate." Victoria turned her head, looking past the trembling matriarch to lock eyes with Arthur. "Arthur," Victoria said, her tone demanding complete honesty. "We need to talk. Right now." The private holding room off the main foyer was suffocatingly quiet, lit only by two gold wall sconces that cast long, muted shadows across the mahogany furniture. Victoria closed the heavy door behind them, shutting out the muffled sounds of the grand ballroom. She turned to face Arthur, resting her hands lightly on the back of an armchair. She didn't look angry. Her expression was remarkably composed, defined by a calm, sharp clarity that made Arthur's pulse race with anxiety. "You're going to tell me the truth, Arthur," Victoria said, her voice smooth, measured, and entirely free of emotional panic. "Not the story your mother spun for the board, and not the polite lie you told me when we first met. I want the real story." Arthur stood near the center of the room, looking visibly worn, his hair slightly disheveled and his tie pulled loose. He swallowed hard, rubbing a hand over his face. "Victoria, I am so sorry you were dragged into this tonight," he began, his voice raspy. "I never intended to humiliate you." "I don't care about being humiliated," Victoria interrupted cleanly, stepping around the chair. "My dignity doesn't shatter because of a scene in a foyer. What I care about is integrity, Arthur. When we agreed to this merger and this engagement, you told me your past relationship ended amicably because of incompatible goals. You never mentioned a child." "Because I didn't know," Arthur exclaimed, the words bursting out of him with desperate sincerity. "I swear to you, Victoria, I had no idea she kept the baby, or that he existed until he looked at me tonight." Victoria tilted her head, her sharp eyes studying the grief and confusion written across his face. "You didn't know," she repeated softly, "or did you choose not to look?" Arthur winced as if struck. 5 years ago, she told me she was pregnant," he admitted, his head dropping as he spoke the words that had haunted him for half a decade. "My mother brought in medical documents, a paternity report stating the child wasn't mine. My mother said she was trying to trap the family, to extort us for money before the acquisition went through." "And you believed your mother?" Victoria asked, without ever asking who controlled the only doctor who could confirm it. "I was weak," Arthur shouted bitterly, slamming his fist onto the side of the desk. "I was terrified of losing my position, terrified of my mother stripping my shares, terrified of the public embarrassment. My mother was so convincing, so absolute, and I was too cowardly to stand up and demand proof. I let her throw the woman I loved out into the cold because I was afraid." He sank into a leather chair, burying his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking slightly. Victoria watched him in silence for a long moment. The pieces were aligning, but a crucial detail didn't add up. She knew Eleanor, Arthur's mother, far too well. Eleanor was a master strategist who never left loose ends. A lie about paternity should have been a 5-day risk, not a 5-year secret. Unless it was never actually retestable. Victoria's mind moved quickly. She remembered it then. Eleanor hadn't just fired the woman from the family. She'd had her sign an exit agreement as a condition of severance. One clause buried in the fine print. All medical records related to the pregnancy remained property of the family's private health trust, filed under privilege, accessible only through Dr. Vance's practice. No hospital, no outside lab had ever held a sample. And by the time she'd landed abroad with no lawyer, no funds, and no standing in a foreign court, there was no legal channel left to force a second opinion, only Eleanor's own doctor and Eleanor's own file. It wasn't a hole in the story. It was the story. Unless, Victoria thought, there was something far larger Eleanor was trying to hide. "Arthur," Victoria said, her tone dropping into a serious, conspiratorial whisper as she stepped closer to his chair. "Think back to 5 years ago, right before she was accused. Was there anything else happening in the company? Any audit? Any document she might have seen?" Arthur looked up, his brows furrowed in sudden confusion. "What do you mean? Your mother didn't just push that girl away to save your reputation," Victoria said, her eyes flashing with sharp intuition. "She destroyed that girl's credibility entirely. Why? What was she really trying to keep that woman from telling you?" Arthur sat frozen in the chair, Victoria's words echoing in the silence of the private holding room. "An audit," Arthur murmured, his brow furrowing as his mind raced back through 5 years of suppressed memories. "No, there was no public audit, but there was an internal review. It was right before the global expansion deal. He stood up slowly, the fog of his past cowardice clearing to reveal a sudden, sharp realization. 5 years ago, weeks before the false paternity papers appeared on his mother's desk, his former wife had been helping manage the family foundation's archival records. She was meticulous, soft-spoken, and quietly brilliant. One evening, she had mentioned coming across a series of off-book offshore transfers routed through a shell company, transfers bearing his late father's legacy signature, but dated after his passing. At the time, Arthur had dismissed it as a clerical misunderstanding, telling her not to worry about complex corporate accounting. He hadn't thought twice about it, but his mother had overheard the conversation. 3 days later, the falsified paternity test was produced. It wasn't just about the baby, Arthur breathed, horror bleeding into his voice as the realization shattered his remaining ignorance. My mother didn't just want her gone. She needed to destroy her credibility completely. If she accused my mother of financial fraud, no one in the family or the board would believe a woman who had been publicly exposed as an unfaithful, money-grabbing liar. Victoria nodded slowly, her expression grave. A classic character assassination. If the board thought she was an extortionist trying to fabricate a fake heir, any claims she made about stolen offshore funds would be dismissed as bitter revenge. The falsified doctor's report. Arthur gritted his teeth, his jaw tightening in white-hot anger. Dr. Vance. He was the family's private physician for 20 years. He was the one who handed over the modified DNA results to my mother. A month after she left, he suddenly retired and moved his practice out of the city. He was paid off, Victoria stated plainly. Or blackmailed. Arthur turned toward the door, his chest heaving. The grief that had weighed him down for 5 years was suddenly replaced by a fierce, driving purpose. He had been too weak to protect the woman he loved back then, but he refused to stay blind any longer. I need to find Vance, Arthur said, his voice dropping into a low, decisive resolve. And I need to get into my mother's private safe at the estate. Victoria reached into her clutch bag, pulled out a small silver key card, and held it out to him with an unshakable calmness. That gets you into the board's private archive server, she said smoothly. My father holds a master key for our merger due diligence. If those offshore transfers exist, they'll be mirrored in the cross-border tax files. Arthur looked at her in surprise. Victoria, why are you helping me? This could ruin your family's merger. I am marrying a partner, Arthur, not a puppet, Victoria said with quiet dignity. And I will not build a marriage or a business on top of an innocent woman's ruined life. Go get your truth. The night air outside the venue was cold, but Arthur barely felt it as he hurried toward his car. Within an hour, he was standing inside the dimly lit study of Dr. Vance's private clinic on the outskirts of the city. The retired doctor, now frail and white-haired, sat behind his desk, trembling as Arthur dropped a thick folder onto the mahogany wood. I know what you did 5 years ago, Vance, Arthur said, his voice terrifyingly quiet, carrying the heavy weight of a man with nothing left to lose. You altered the paternity test for my mother. You destroyed an innocent woman's life and made me turn my back on my own son. Dr. Vance swallowed hard, his eyes darting toward the closed door. Arthur, you don't understand the pressure your mother put on me. She threatened my license. She said she would destroy my family's medical legacy if I didn't sign off on the modified lab results. Where is the original lab report? Arthur demanded, leaning over the desk, his knuckles turning white. The real one. With a shaky breath, the old doctor pulled open a bottom drawer, retrieved a small key, and unlocked a small floor safe behind his desk. He pulled out an aged, sealed manila envelope and handed it over. I kept a copy of the authentic DNA profile from the independent lab, Vance whispered, his voice laced with years of unaddressed guilt. I knew this day would come. The probability of paternity was 99.9%. The boy is yours, Arthur. He always was. Arthur clutched the document in his hand, his eyes burning as he read the official stamp on the paper. The physical evidence was right there in black and white. Using Victoria's keycard, Arthur drove straight to the family's corporate headquarters, bypassing the night security to enter the executive archives. Plugging the encrypted card into the master server, he pulled up the cross-border tax audit files from 5 years prior. The truth unraveled fast on the glowing screen. Over $12 million had been funneled through an offshore account registered under his mother's maiden name. The dates aligned perfectly. The fraudulent transfers had been flagged by his former wife just 2 days before his mother produced the fake paternity report. His mother hadn't just been protecting the family image. She had been protecting herself from a prison sentence. Arthur printed the paper trail, combining it with the original DNA report into a single, undeniable file. His heart pounded with a mixture of profound grief and white-hot anger. He pulled out his phone, his thumb hovering over the screen, as he prepared for the confrontation that would tear his family's empire apart. The grand ballroom had thinned out, but the core players remained. The board members, executive partners, and senior investors were gathered in the private VIP lounge, whispering anxiously over champagne. Eleanor stood near the marble fireplace, maintaining a rigid smile, trying desperately to assure the lead director that the earlier scene was nothing more than an unfortunate misunderstanding. Then the heavy doors burst open. Arthur strode into the room, his eyes sharp and burning with absolute clarity. Behind him, Victoria entered quietly, taking her place beside her father, the primary investor in the upcoming merger. "Arthur, where have you been?" Eleanor said, her voice dropping into a harsh, warning whisper as she stepped toward him. "You disappeared during our most critical event. We are trying to repair the damage you caused. The only person who damaged this family is sitting right here," Arthur declared, his voice echoing loudly across the silent room, commanding the attention of every executive present. He didn't hesitate. He tossed a thick manila folder directly onto the glass coffee table in the center of the lounge. "What is the meaning of this childish drama?" Eleanor sneered, though a flicker of cold fear flashed in her eyes as she saw the official medical seal stamped on the top paper. "That is the original, unedited DNA report from 5 years ago, authenticated by Dr. Vance," Arthur said, looking his mother dead in the eye. "The boy is my son. The story you sold to me, to the board, and to the public 5 years ago was a complete fabrication." Gasps rippled through the room. Board members leaned forward, exchanging shocked glances. "He's lying," Eleanor snapped, her voice rising in pitch as she turned to the board. "Dr. Vance is senile. This woman has manipulated my son into." "Dr. Vance signed a sworn affidavit an hour ago." "Eleanor," Arthur interrupted, his tone chillingly calm. "He confessed that you paid him off and threatened his license to fake the paternity test." Arthur reached down, flipping to the second section of the file. "And this is the real reason you had to destroy an innocent woman's name. 5 years ago, she discovered a series of off-book offshore accounts bearing my late father's signature after his death. $12 million funneled directly into a private entity in your name." The lead director stood up, his face pale as he picked up the financial records from the table. He scanned the bank stamps and signatures, his jaw tightening. "Eleanor, these are tax fraud and embezzlement records." "It's a lie," Eleanor panicked, her composure shattering into desperate rage as she looked around at the cold, judgmental faces of her peers. "I did it for the company. I protected our assets." "You protected yourself," Victoria spoke up smoothly, stepping beside her father. "And you used an innocent pregnant woman as a scapegoat to cover your crime. My family is officially pulling out of the merger, effective immediately." Eleanor stumbled back against the mantel, her hands shaking, her breath coming in ragged gasps. For 5 years, she had ruled her empire through fear, lies, and control. In less than 10 minutes, it had all crumbled to dust. Arthur looked at his ruined mother one last time, feeling no vengeance, only a deep, quiet resolve. "You're done, Mother," Arthur said softly. He turned on his heel and walked out of the room, leaving the corporate world he had once cowered behind to finally claim his true responsibility. The suburban cafe was small, quiet, and filled with the gentle, warm aroma of freshly ground coffee and baked pastry. Morning sunlight streamed through the tall glass windows, far removed from the cold, intimidating chandeliers of the corporate ballroom. She sat at a corner table near the window, cradling a mug of tea in her hands. Beside her, Leo was happily coloring a drawing of a sailboat, completely unbothered by the quiet tension resting in the air. When the bell above the door chimed, she didn't look up right away, but she felt the shift in energy. Arthur stepped into the cafe. He wasn't wearing his usual tailor-made suit or polished cufflinks. He wore a simple coat, his posture devoid of the commanding executive aura he had carried for years. He looked tired, but for the first time in 5 years, his eyes were clear. "May I sit down?" he asked softly, halting a few feet from their table. She looked at him for a long moment, then gave a single, calm nod. "Go ahead, Arthur." Arthur pulled out a chair, sitting down with quiet care. His gaze lingered on Leo for a second, a soft, painful swell of affection washing over him, before he focused entirely on her. "The merger is officially off," Arthur began, his voice low and steady. "The board has opened a full forensic audit into my mother's actions, and the authorities have been notified about the offshore transfers. She will face the consequences of what she did." "I heard," she replied quietly. "News travels fast in corporate media. I didn't come here to talk about her, though," Arthur said, leaning forward slightly, his hands resting on the table. "I came to tell you I know everything now. I went to Dr. Vance. I saw the original DNA report. I saw what my mother did to fabricate those papers to cover her own crimes." He took a slow, deep breath, his voice trembling with a vulnerability he had spent his whole life hiding. "I know an apology will never erase the 5 years you spent raising our son alone in exile," Arthur continued, meeting her eyes directly. "I know I failed you in the worst way possible by being a coward when you needed me to stand by you. I don't expect you to forgive me, and I certainly don't expect you to take me back." She remained silent, listening with the same immovable dignity that had defined her entire journey. "I just want to make things right for Leo," Arthur pleaded softly, a tear threatening to spill from his eye. "I want to be a father to him. I want to support him, take responsibility, and give him everything he deserves. And if you'll let me, I want a chance to earn back a fraction of your trust. Not as a CEO, but as a man who finally grew up." Leo put his crayon down, looking up from his paper with wide, curious eyes. He looked at Arthur, then at his mother, sensing the heavy weight of the moment. She set her teacup down with a soft clink, her calm gaze assessing the man sitting across from her. She reached out, gently patting Leo's small hand, before looking back at Arthur. Her expression was serene, free of anger, free of bitterness, and completely grounded in the strength she had built over half a decade. "Arthur," she began, her voice smooth and deliberate, "5 years ago, I walked out of your family's house with nothing but my son and my self-respect. I cried every night on the plane, wondering how I was going to survive. But I did survive. I built a career, I built a home, and I raised a kind, brilliant boy all on my own." She took a slow breath, letting her words sink in. "I don't hate you," she said softly. "Anger is a burden, and I refuse to carry it while raising our son. But the woman who needed your protection back then doesn't exist anymore. I don't need a savior, and I don't need a husband. Arthur's chest tightened, but he listened, nodding slowly in quiet acceptance. However, she continued, her posture remaining tall. Leo deserves to know his father. He deserves to know that he was never unwanted. If you want to be in his life, I will not stand in your way. Arthur looked up, a wave of profound relief washing over his face. Thank you, he whispered, his voice cracking. Thank you, that's more than I deserve. We will do this properly, she stated firmly, establishing her boundaries with absolute clarity. Gradually, on my terms and at Leo's pace. No press, no corporate image games, and no family politics. Just you learning how to be a dad. On your terms, Arthur agreed instantly, a tear finally escaping and running down his cheek. Whatever you say. She turned to her son with a gentle smile. Leo, sweetheart? Yes, Mommy? This is Arthur, she said softly, introducing them not with grand declarations of royalty or broken promises, but with simple, quiet truth. He's going to be spending some time with us from now on. Leo looked at Arthur for a long second, his small brow furrowed in thought. Then, he picked up a blue crayon from his box and held it across the table toward Arthur. Do you know how to draw a boat? Leo asked innocently. A watery smile broke across Arthur's face as he reached out and took the crayon with trembling, grateful hands. I can learn, Arthur said softly. I'd really like to learn. She watched them, a feeling of deep, unshakable peace filling her heart. She hadn't sought revenge, nor had she compromised her dignity to win back a place in a wealthy house. She had held fast to her truth, protected her child, and emerged victorious not by tearing others down, but by standing tall on her own 2 feet. As the morning sun bathed the quiet table in warm, golden light, a new chapter began, built not on the lies of the past, but on the quiet, earned dignity of the present. CTA, if this story moved you, hit like, drop a comment telling us your favorite moment, and subscribe for more stories like this one.